Hello, and thank you for joining today's session focused on purchase order best practices. This is Alex DiFrancesco from the Statewide Financial System, and I'm joined today by Paul Olson from the Business Services Center, Kevin Riggi, Connie Soreski, and Maria Caduti from the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historical Preservation. This session will review best practices for setting up purchase orders associated with statewide and agency contracts in SFS. Let's take a look at our agenda for today. We'll start with a brief review of purchase order basics, then we'll talk about best practices for purchase order setup. After we talk conceptually about the best practices, the Parks team is going to show us a few examples of actual POs they set up in SFS, which are in alignment with best practices. We'll wrap up with a review of available resources. Questions can be entered at any time in the WebEx chat. However, we're going to hold our Q&A section until the end of the presentation. So before we dive into the attributes of best practice purchase orders, I want to spend a few minutes talking about purchase order basics to make sure that everyone has a foundational understanding of what purchase orders are, the type of information they include, and how they're used. A purchase order is a communication tool between agencies and vendors. The PO tells the vendor that your agency has authorized the purchase of specific goods or services and tells the vendor where those goods or services should be delivered. In addition to being a method of communication with your vendors, the information that's entered on the PO also provides helpful input towards understanding what the state is purchasing. Having detailed PO line descriptions and using the appropriate category code on your POs are examples of how the information on POs provides your agency and the state of New York with better insight on what's being purchased. We'll talk more about the importance of detailed PO line descriptions and category codes later in the session. A PO's life cycle varies depending on what's being purchased from the vendor. POs remain active until the final payment is processed. Depending on what's been ordered, some POs may remain open and active for a short period of time, while other POs remain open and active for 1 or more years. There may also be scenarios where you need to make changes to a purchase order after it's sent to the vendor. Maybe you need to increase or decrease the quantity or amount that was initially ordered. Purchase order change notices are used as a way to communicate with your vendor any changes to the original PO terms. Any changes to a PO should be dispatched to the vendor so that the information the vendor has is in alignment with the information you have within your agency. The only exception to that rule is if the change to the PO is limited to the accounting or chart field values. You don't need to communicate those types of changes to the vendor. When you're setting up your purchase orders, it's really important to think about the big picture. Best practice PO setup doesn't just help the vendor know exactly what you're ordering. It helps support more efficient downstream processes within your agency. For example, if your POs have the correct ship-to location, those goods will be delivered to the right location the first time, which means you're not spending time moving product from one location to another. You get the goods at the right location the first time. Detailed PO line descriptions on your POs not only help the vendor, but they help your receivers identify the right PO line to use when they're entering the receipts in SFS. And when the vendor sends in their invoices, those invoices are going to include the PO ID that your agency initially provided to the vendor, making it clear which PO and PO line should be associated with the invoice used to create the voucher for payment. Properly set up purchase orders have the potential to more effectively leverage system automation and optimize the end-to-end procurement to payment process using the statewide financial system. So let's talk a little bit about how purchase orders are created. So most frequently, purchase orders are created in SFS systematically through a staged requisition or through a contract release. So what do we mean by creating POs through a staged requisition? So a requisition is a transaction in SFS that represents the initial request for goods or services. Requisitions are entered in SFS by requesters, and then the information entered on the requisition is used by the PO processor, also known as the buyer, as the starting point to perform those procurement sourcing activities to address the request. Systematically speaking, buyers use the requisition selection page in SFS to review the requisition, assign a vendor, update quantities and amounts as needed, assign a contract if applicable, and basically prepare the requisition to be staged or auto-sourced into a purchase order. The buyer has the opportunity to do a final review and refinement of the PO before submission into workflow. So using this route, which happens most frequently, the information that's entered on the requisition is used as the starting point towards creating the purchase order. Alternatively, agencies can create POs through a contract release. Stage releases or schedules can be created in the procurement contract module in the statewide financial system. A stage release allows you to systematically release a contract based on predefined parameters and can be established for the creation of one or multiple POs over a period of time. On each stage release, you define the required information, such as contract lines, amounts, quantities, and you specify the frequency to create your purchase orders. All right, let's talk a little bit about the structure of a purchase order. Purchase orders consist of a PO header, one or more PO lines, a PO footer, and comments and attachments. The PO header provides summary level information about the purchase order. In the PO header, you'll see things like your agency name, vendor information, payment terms, the PO ID and date. You'll see where the goods or services should be shipped to, where the invoices should be sent to, and contact information for the buyer. The PO lines are used to describe what you're ordering. A PO can have one line or multiple lines. Each PO line will have a quantity and unit of measure or amount. You can have comments associated with each PO line as well. And the PO line is also where you would add the contract ID if applicable. Each PO line is set up as a quantity-based or amount-based line. Quantity-based PO lines document the exact quantity of goods or quantifiable services being ordered by the agency. Quantity-based PO lines should be used wherever possible. Quantity-based PO lines are straightforward and they're nice to work with and generally make the receiving process downstream easier. Basically, as soon as the vendor fulfills that order, your receivers can enter the receipt of those goods or quantifiable services directly in SFS by entering the quantity received and the date of receipt. There's no need to wait for the invoice to enter the receipt in SFS, which means you can enter receipts timely and proactively. Timely proactive receiving, performed at the time the goods or quantifiable services are delivered or by the next business day, is in alignment with the OSC policy on receiving. Amount-based PO lines document the exact amount of non-quantifiable services being ordered by the agency. At the bottom portion of the purchase order, that's what we call the PO footer. The PO footer is where vendors see comments and the total PO amount. So after the purchase order has been set up, reviewed, approved, and successfully budget checked, the purchase order is dispatched to the vendor. Dispatched is another way of saying that we've sent out the purchase order to the vendor. Email is the state's primary method of PO dispatch to vendors. This slide includes a sample of the email that vendors receive along with the purchase order when it's dispatched from the statewide financial system. When a vendor receives a purchase order, they receive the unique purchase order number generated in SFS known as the PO ID, the name of the buyer at the agency or at the Business Services Center for BSC customers who can be contacted with questions about the order, a copy of the purchase order in the form of a PDF attachment, and any attachments with documentation relevant to the order. So this slide includes a copy of what a dispatched purchase order looks like. And you'll see the different sections of the purchase order that we spoke about a little earlier. The top of the purchase order is where we see the PO header. That includes information like your agency name. We have our vendor information up there, our payment terms, the purchase order ID, the ship to location, the bill to location, and the buyer name and contact information. In the middle of the purchase order, we see the PO line. That includes information about the line, quantity, unit of measure, amount, the specific item or services that we are ordering from the vendor. Any comments that were entered on the PO line in SFS will also be visible here. Comments that were entered in the PO header when the PO was being worked in SFS are also visible in the comments section. And at the bottom of the PO footer, that's where you'll see the total purchase order amount. Now I'm going to turn it over to Paul Olson at the Business Services Center, who will talk specifically about the attributes of a best practice purchase order.
Thank you, Alex. This is Paul Olson with the Business Services Center, work in the purchasing unit. And I'm just going to use the next several slides to go into a little bit more detail about what Alex just touched on with our best practice talking points that she just introduced. And so on this slide, we have several of the bullet points for our important best practice points. Our detailed PO line descriptions or catalog items, which we'll talk a little bit more about. The receiving setup as required, which is very important. PO best practice is that purchase orders are set up with receiving required. This will assist with the downstream processes that go along with your purchase orders. Setting up the exact quantity or the exact or estimated dollar amount on your purchase offers for that procurement that's being ordered. Also utilizing the appropriate unit of measure on your purchase orders. Using actual ship-to locations on your POs. Ship-to locations are extremely important for our vendors, right? To understand where goods are being shipped or where specific services are being performed. Also, the proper bill-to information. Also extremely important to vendors to know where are they sending their invoices? What is the office or the entity that it will be paying them for these goods or services? And then using accurate category codes to select on your purchase orders. Category codes are very important for reporting purposes, also for identifying what type of procurement it is that you're making. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about those as well. The comments and or agency contact information on your purchase order used to communicate with vendors, right? So we'll touch on this a little bit, but any additional information that goes along with the procurement that you're making that needs to be communicated to these vendors can be applied to your purchase orders in several different locations within Statewide Financial System. OGS centralized or agency-specific contract IDs, as well as agency purchase authorization contracts, identifying those contracts when they apply to the procurement and properly attaching those contract IDs to your purchase order. And then finally, Alex just touched on the dispatch method being set to email. Best practice is that systematically through the Statewide Financial System, the final version of your purchase order, when approved, is dispatched via email electronically through SFS to your vendors. And so we'll go into a little bit more detail about that as well. So as we go through these slides, also, I want to talk about not only the different important pieces of PO best practices, but why are they important? And what does it mean to our state agencies as well as to our vendors? So each of your PO line descriptions should be clear and concise. We want to describe in detail the goods or services that are being ordered. Now, if you are a customer and utilize the Statewide Financial System, the PO line description allows up to 254 characters for each PO line. So plenty of room to give a lot of detail about what it is you're ordering. And so a few bullet points here about what you want to include in your PO line descriptions. An accurate description of the product or service. That may include the size, color. If you have specific item IDs associated to that vendor's product or a product code, those can be extremely important to include, not only for the agency placing the order, but for the vendor to be able to readily identify what it is that you're buying. Titles of an individual. Now, this would apply to administrative services orders, right? If you are utilizing the admin services contract and need to identify the type of service that you're ordering, the title of that individual is extremely important. Specific facility information and period of coverage. So this applies to ordering services. Where are those services being provided, and how long do you anticipate the coverage period for these services? And then really in detail, the scope of work and deliverable associated, right? So you want to spell out for the vendor and for agency purposes downstream, which we'll get a little bit more into later, But you want to be as detailed as possible so everybody is on the same page about what is being ordered. It's also important not to include some information, right? We don't want to go overboard and include confidential or sensitive information on these PO line descriptions. A few examples would be social security numbers, credit card numbers, any medical information. We do not want to include that in the PO line description. That may go, without saying, but it is important to note that we want to eliminate any sensitive information being included. And so I mentioned that these detailed PO line descriptions, being as concise as possible, will support the downstream processes within Statewide financial system as well. That includes the receiving, the invoicing by the vendors of these goods, as well as the voucher processing. So it assists the vendor up front, and it also assists the accounts payable office and the payment offices downstream. It provides a lot of clarity about what's going on and speeds up the end-to-end process. So here's a few good examples of PO line descriptions where we have applied best practices. The first one is the admin services PO that I mentioned. You'll see the title. We start with the title of a registered nurse. We give the time period that we are hiring that temp for. The agency RFQ number that's associated with this procurement is also included, and then the lot and the region that this applies to as well. Maintenance services are the second bullet here. The annual on-site HVAC equipment maintenance, right? We're spelling out exactly what it is that we're ordering and being very clear with the vendor. It gives the region, Central New York facility, and it gives the unit ID code that applies to that region. And then the last one is a commodity description. This one's a good example of a typical catalog item or an e-marketplace item that includes the vendor supplier item ID, right? So that E5391 number identifies to the vendor what that exact item is that you're ordering, and then goes into even more detail about what that item is, as good as possible, right? Okay, so setting up your purchase orders as receiving required. Alex mentioned this, and I touched on it a little bit earlier. This is best practice to set up your POs as receiving required. After a vendor fulfills your purchase order and the agency receives the item, we want to create an online receipt within SFS to identify that you have indeed received those goods or those services from that vendor. Ideally, these receipts would be created within 1 to 2 business days of the actual receiving taking place. This receiving can be performed by quantity or amount within the system, and that's defined by the way that purchase order line is established up front. But we'll get into a little bit more detail, and Alex also touched on the difference between quantity-based and amount-only lines. Entering a receipt in SFS is going to eliminate the need to maintain those records outside of the system. So SFS, being the official repository for procurement records, is important. And by entering those online receipts, you have that documented in your procurement record within the system that you received those goods. So it serves as a validation for your agencies and supports the agency's internal controls, enabling you guys to properly account for all of those goods and services that have been provided. So we mentioned it is best practice to set up your purchase orders as receiving required. That being said, there is an understanding that that's not always relevant to enter a receipt. Some purchases are made up front and have already been delivered. Those are known as confirming orders. There are some exceptions to setting up your POs as receiving required, and those exceptions are outlined for you in the OSC Guide to Financial Operations, or the GFO. So back to the quantity-based purchase orders versus amount-based POs. A quantity-based purchase order is when a good is a quantifiable service is being ordered and can be received by quantity. So this is the preferred method for establishing purchase orders when possible as a quantity-based order, especially when ordering commodities. You want to enter on your purchase order the exact quantity of goods or those quantifiable services being ordered, such as those admin services purchase orders that I touched on earlier. If you have an exact amount of hours anticipated for those administrative services, or even an estimated amount of hours that you can put and quantify on your purchase order, that is the ideal process. And then throughout the life of that purchase order, you can always enter a purchase order change notice if additional quantities are needed after that initial PO is dispatched to the vendor. And so nothing is set in stone on your initial purchase order, and throughout the life cycle of your PO, you have the ability to add or subtract hours or quantities as you go. Amount-based purchase orders. So while we recommend that typically you would do a quantity-based order when possible, we also understand that there are several non-quantifiable services that are ordered, right? And when this applies, you want to do your purchase orders as amount-based. If you don't know the exact quantity of something being ordered, or you have an estimated dollar amount that you're going to spend over a given period of time, or you understand that this vendor that you're utilizing has fluctuating prices throughout the life of your purchase order, that is when you would want to establish your purchase order as amount-based. Now, the same rule applies for the purchase order change notice with amount-based. You have the ability to add or subtract any funding throughout the life of the purchase order where necessary, and amount-based purchase orders are always going to be established with a quantity of one, and it is recommended that you use the unit of measure of each. So I touched briefly on unit of measures in the beginning of the presentation, and we'll get into a little bit more detail about that. But when utilizing amount-based POs, you want to use EA or each as your unit of measure. Ship-to locations. So ship-to locations are going to identify to the vendor where those goods or services that you're ordering are being provided, right? And also within that ship-to location, you have the ability to add contact information. So not only where are the goods or services being delivered or performed, but who are they contacting to deliver those goods or services? Each PO line in SFS, this is very important, can have one or more ship-to locations identified. So you do not have to use one standard ship-to location on your purchase orders. Within SFS, you have the ability to split up an order and send to different locations. So that's important to know. Each ship-to location within SFS is identified by an alphanumeric ID. You see the example over on the right-hand side of this slide. OMH01-02015 is the ship-to code. So many of the ship-to codes are identified that way within SFS. But then you'll see below that it goes into greater detail about that location. The Middletown campus, it gives you the exact address. It's telling you that this is going directly to the storehouse, and that storehouse is located at the rear of the building. Gives you the hours of operation and notes that a lift gate is required. So this is all important information for these vendors to have up front before they attempt to deliver these goods. Having these accurate ship-to locations and using those correct ship-to IDs is also going to assist with timely receiving. So I mentioned that we would like to see receipts processed within 1 to 2 business days of receiving those actual goods or services. Having that ship-to location available within SFS will help tremendously with that process. Agencies can request new ship-to locations to be created or any updates to existing ship-to locations via SFS using the location and ship-to code request form template. This template form is available to all users on SFS Secure. And now bill-to information, equally as important as the ship-to information, right? These vendors need to know where they are sending their invoices to and how they will be receiving their payment. So the bill-to information on your purchase order should reflect the agency's official designated payment office. Now, for those agencies that are hosted by the Business Services Center, that designated payment office will be the BSC Accounts Payable Office, and you see that example listed over to the right-hand side. For any agencies that are not hosted by the BSC, the designated payment office would be the office within their company, right? So the agency's official designated payment office outside of the Business Services Center. Agencies can also control the address that populates for this bill to information using the PO default section on the purchase order in SFS. Category codes. So we touched on category codes a little bit earlier as well. A category code is used to identify or classify the product or service that you're ordering, and is a huge part of the reporting process on procurement data from SFS. So category codes are automatically included on the requisition if you are utilizing those SFS catalogs or the New York State e-marketplace within SFS. So when you utilize these two options, that category by default is built into the commodity that you are purchasing and will populate for you. If you are utilizing a general requisition or special request requisition in SFS, you must manually enter that category code on your order for each individual requisition or purchase order line. Now, agencies want to select the most detailed category code possible, and it needs to be appropriate for the purchase that's being made. This is very important for downstream reporting, for DOB and OSC reporting on what is being purchased, right? It helps the state as a whole track what is being purchased throughout the entirety of the state and how much money is being spent in certain categories. So very important to get the appropriate category code that most closely is associated with what you're purchasing. And so that being said, category codes can be 10 digits, right? And not everybody is going to memorize a 10-digit category code for every type of purchase that you're making. And so that is completely understandable. If you're not sure what category code you should be using for your purchase, there is the category code selection tool available to all users within SFS Secure. And what that category code selection tool does is it guides users for selecting that appropriate category code. So whether it's a centralized contract, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well, or a discretionary purchase in SFS, those category codes are available to you using this tool and can help you identify which is the appropriate category code that you should be using. So here's an example of that category code selection tool and a little picture of what it looks like. You utilize it through SFS Secure, as I mentioned. You use the References and Resources tab, navigate to the Procurement Information Center, and again, the References and Resources tab. This tool is going to include a few different tabs for users to access. It gives you a little introduction to the category code selection tool, identifying what it is that's included in this tool. It lists out all of the category codes that are available within SFS for users. So some of these category codes are very detailed, right? And many of them you may never use, but all of them are available to you on this tool to navigate through. And then there's also a tab for a condensed list of category codes. And this is important. The condensed category code list really breaks down a list of important category codes and the most commonly used category codes throughout the state. And so we encourage you to use this category code selection tool from SFS Secure to help identify the types of purchases that you're making. I can't overstate, the importance of using the appropriate category code on your purchase orders. Now, PO comments. I also mentioned this a little bit briefly earlier. Comments that are included on your purchase order are important to help provide the vendor with additional details that are pertinent to your order. So that means that you have already entered a really descriptive PO line description to help identify the goods or services that you're ordering. But also these PO comments are available to you to identify any additional information. So we touched on the ship to location or the bill to location that gives you access to provide detailed descriptions of where something is being delivered. But maybe you have even more specific instructions or specific contact information that you need to relay to the vendors. And that is where you would want to utilize your purchase order comments. These comments can be added in several different places within SFS on your requisitions or purchase orders. You can use the PO header, the PO line comments, or the PO footer. Now, we would recommend that those PO header comments, when utilizing those should include information that are pertinent to the entire purchase order. So these apply to the purchase order as a whole. If you're utilizing PO line comments, these PO line comments would be more specific to that individual purchase order line. So if you have details for a specific PO line, you want to utilize the PO line comments. And then the PO footer comments, not really used as often for SFS users entering requisitions or purchase orders, but these are more for standard comments that also apply to the purchase order as a whole. But we utilize at the Business Services Center especially the PO footer comments for identifying how to appropriately submit an invoice, where to send those invoices to, and it also includes the appendix, New York State Appendix A, which details the rules and regulations that apply to all purchase orders issued through New York State agencies. Now, again, we want to note that you do not want to include confidential information in these PO comments. Any sensitive information should be left off of the purchase orders, but there are standard comments available to you for these PO comment sections as well. So some of the standard comments are listed here in bullets on this slide. You'll notice the SFSPL or AC 130 terms, Appendix A, blanket order, confirming order, payment request and processing, and then P-card. So what these standard comments are is the Business Services Center and SFS work closely on, I think, a lot of these, if not all of these standard comments, to come up with a way for users to quickly add comments that apply to these type of purchases on your PO. These standard comments will show up on the purchase order for the vendor to acknowledge. And really what they are is just spelling out what these types of orders are and the important information that goes along with it. Contract IDs. So contract IDs are pretty self-explanatory. There's a few different types of contracts that are used within Statewide Financial System. And those are the OGS centralized contracts, your agency-funded or non-funded contracts, and then your purchase authorization contracts, which kind of fall into those categories. Contract IDs, when appropriate, should be identified on the purchase order. How do you identify a contract ID on a purchase order? Within SFS, you have the ability to utilize a contract tab on your requisition or purchase order. And as long as you have the correct vendor ID that's associated to that supplier that you're using, linked to your purchase order or requisition, those contract IDs associated to those vendors are readily available to you within the system to just select and add to your purchase order. So extremely important when you are doing a contract purchase to identify what contract you are using on each individual purchase order line. So many times agencies will set up a purchase order where they may be ordering some goods off of contract and some are not covered on the contract. So you have that ability to identify the contract on those specific lines and break out your purchase orders as necessary. So back to the category code. This is a big factor when utilizing contracts as well. When utilizing centralized contracts especially, you want to select the appropriate category code that is already associated with that centralized contract in SFS. So when establishing that contract and going through OSC for the proper approvals, a category code that most accurately describes what you're purchasing is identified and should be used on your purchase orders that are tied to those contracts. Again, if you are uncertain about which category code you should be using and you are utilizing a centralized contract, you have the ability to navigate to that contract within SFS and look up the category code in that contract header that is associated with the contract you're using. PO dispatch. So this is a very important part of the process for end-to-end procurements. Best practice POs, as Alex also mentioned, are email dispatch. So what that means is after your purchase order has been fully approved and passes all necessary budget and PSP budget checks, your purchase order will be dispatched to the vendors. These purchase orders should ideally be dispatched using the email dispatch method within SFS, where a systematic email is sent to the vendor with a PDF copy of your purchase order, along with any other documents that you have identified on that purchase order that need to go to that vendor. So that could be a quote, it could be a special form, it could be delivery instructions that are separate for what is on the purchase order. There are several different types of dispatch available to you within SFS. Email dispatch, again, is the best practice method. Sometimes you may not want a purchase order to go to a vendor for whatever reason. We only recommend using this print dispatch method, is what it's called, when a purchase or service has already been provided. So for confirming orders, where you don't want the vendor to have a copy of that purchase order to avoid any duplicate deliveries or duplicate orders, is when you would use the print dispatch method. There's also an Edx dispatch method available in SFS. This is an electronic dispatch that is a paid service by the vendors pay for this service to have these purchase orders sent EDX and automatically transmitted to their internal system at the vendor. So that is also used. Oftentimes, it is used for e-marketplace vendors. But we do recommend that when possible, vendors are established with email as their default dispatch method. Now, it's important for agencies to remind vendors to regularly log into the Sfs Vendor Portal. This Sfs Vendor Portal is accessible to all vendors, and it helps them view their purchase orders. They can track the process of their purchase orders. It has payment information readily available to them. So it's a really good tool for vendors to be using to not only identify which POs they're utilizing, but follow the process from start to finish as well. So this PO dispatch process runs automatically in SFS every 2 hours, and that starts at 8 a.m. And it's every even hour until 4 o'clock p.m. Monday through Friday. So I want to mention also that part of the service that the Business Services Center offers to their customers is that once a purchase order has been fully approved and is being dispatched to the vendor, we monitor what's called the PO dispatch mailbox to ensure that these purchase orders are making it to the appropriate location at that vendor. So we're identifying the email dispatch for these vendors, the email address associated up front, and ensuring that your purchase orders are correctly received by these vendors. If for some reason the purchase order does not make it, we will be identified and we will work with either the agency or the vendor to ensure that they get a copy. Okay, so PO information and just some general reminders about what we just talked about. So Alex introduced these PO best practices in the beginning, and we just went through really great detail about why these are important. So again, you want to include always as much detail and information on your purchase orders as possible as a best practice. Accuracy and clarity of the PO data is important, not only for agencies and for the vendors, but also for reporting purposes downstream and faster payments of these purchase orders. I just wanted to note that the time that is spent up front setting up these purchase orders with the best practices in mind goes a long way to saving time later down the road. And I can't stress enough that putting that extra effort in up front on your POs and having them set up properly, like we just talked about, it's going to really support the downstream payment processes, which not only helps your counterparts and friends in your accounts payable offices, but also helps the vendors get paid on time and maintains those good relationships that our agencies have with their vendors. So I think that is it for me. I will hand it back over to Alex now and also to our parks team to give you a few examples of what we just talked about.
Thank you, Paul. All right, so far today, we've talked about purchase order basics and some fundamentals, and Paul just talked about the attributes of best practice purchase orders. So now we're going to take it a step further and show you some actual purchase orders created by the parks team, which are in alignment with these best practice attributes that we just talked about. So our first example, we're going to look at a quantity-based purchase order, and the second example is an amount-based purchase order. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Riggy from Parks to talk more about Parks purchasing and the two PO examples that we will be looking at today.
Great. Thank you, Alex. Good morning, everyone. This is Kevin Riggy, the Purchasing Supervisor at Parks and Recreation. Alex and Paul have done a great job of taking you through the basics and best practices for PO setup. We will now be walking you through how Parks applies these best practices to our purchase orders. We do a wide variety of purchasing at Parks, from uniforms for our park workers and lifeguards, to ponchos for our Cave of the Winds attraction at Niagara Falls, to fertilizers and herbicides for all of our golf courses, including the prestigious Bethpage Black on Long Island, which has hosted several PGA Tour events, including the Masters Tournament. So as you can see, a lot of thought and preparation go into setting up our purchase orders, everything from ship-to locations to detailed line descriptions to special instructions or comments. As Alex mentioned, we have chosen a couple of examples to walk through to help better explain why the purchase orders were set up the way they were. We have selected both an amount-based purchase order and a quantity-based purchase order as our examples to help explain why the POs were set up differently. Our first example is a quantity-based purchase order. Here to talk you through that example is Parks Purchasing Team member Maria Caduti. Maria?
Thank you, Kevin. Good morning. This is Maria Caduti from New York State Parks and Recreation in the Purchasing Unit. Our first example that we will discuss is a quantity-based PO. At the start of the fall season, Parks will request to purchase road salt for the upcoming winter months. At the top of the PO, you can see the supplier ID. Below the number is the name of the company, American Rock Salt, with the company's address. To the right of the supplier name is the delivery location, which is a specified address in the Allegheny region. The bill to location is listed as the BSC. Since we are hosted by the BSC, all invoices should be submitted to this location. All lines should have a detailed description that will inform the vendor of the exact items that are to be purchased. The description for line 1 is road salt for winter road maintenance. The quantity ordered is 400 tons at $64 per ton, which is the price listed on the contract in the county for the delivery location. The description for line 2 is an estimated fuel surcharge. The exact amount of this charge is not known until after the delivery is made and the invoice received. This charge fluctuates monthly, which is determined by the month of the delivery and the amount delivered. To ensure the correct dollar amount is paid on line 2, we opt to make this line amount only. Additional funds can be added to this line if we exceed the estimated amount. Both lines reference the contract ID number associated to the OGS contract number for American Rock Salt. Below line 2 is the comment section. This section is used to provide the vendor with additional information or instructions. On this PO, it shows the agency contact email address. And delivery locations will be made to the Red House Salt Barn, facility contact person, and phone number. Once the PO is complete, the PO is dispatched via email to the vendor's email address on file in SFS. This concludes the quantity-based PO example. We will now transition to Connie Soreski for an amount-based PO example.
Thank you, Maria, and good morning. This is Connie Soreski with New York State Parks in the Purchasing Unit. So I'm going to talk about the amount-based PO. So at the very top of the PO, you will see the supplier ID number, and below the number, you'll see the name of the company. In this example, this company is DF Stone Contracting, and their address is shown right below their name. Now, if you go across the top of the PO, you'll see the ship to. This PO says see details below, so I'll discuss that as we discuss each line. Below the ship to is also the bill to. Parks has the BSC address as we are host by the BSC and invoices are to go to the BSC. So let's go down to line 1. Line 1, our description shows that we are purchasing and having delivered clean beach sand. For this line, we're getting 10,000 cubic yards, and it also gives information where we want the delivery to be within the park. In this line, it says parking fields 6 and 8. Next, you'll see the price. The price is $27.48 per cubic yard. That's also in the description. Because because as you'll see, we have one each for a grand total of $274,800 for this line. This line was set up as an amount-only line. That way, partial payments can be made against the line. The line is set up as receiving as required, so once the delivery has been made, a receiving report can be done in SFS. Then once we receive the invoice, or once the BSC receives the invoice, a payment for that delivery can be processed. Now you'll see the ship to for this one. This Clean Beach Sand is going to be delivered to Heckscher State Park, which is located within our Long Island region. And down below that, you'll see there's a contact phone number. So the vendor does have a contact to reach out to our park if needed. But below that, you'll see there's a contract number. We'll talk about that in a minute. But then Parks has down below that, which would be our comment that says Parks will call vendor when deliveries are required. We want the vendor to know we're going to contact them when we need a delivery of our Clean Beach Sand. So anyway, now let's go down to line 2. Line 2 basically has the same information on it. This time we're getting delivered 16,400 cubic yards of Clean Beach Sand. And it's going to go to our east parking lot, and the price is also $27.48 per cubic yard. The line is also set up for amount only, again, so receiving reports can be done for deliveries and payments can be processed. The grand total for this line is $450,672. Below this description is a ship to. Now this one, ship to, is Captree State Park. So on this PO, we have two different delivery parks. This park is also within our Long Island region. Again, you'll see a phone number so the vendor can reach out to the park if they need to ask us any questions. But below the contract information, again, Parks has a comment that says Parks will call vendor when deliveries are required. Now, going back to that contract line just above it, you'll see the contract ends at 82380. This number was generated to us in SFS when we entered our bid information. This was a bid that was done by the Parks employees and went to OSC and was approved. And it's also associated at the very top, right below the supplier's name, you'll see New York State Contract ID number, and it has PA 20003, which is associated with that contract 82380. In the formal bid that Parks did, we had language in our bid that said the contract would also be a 5-year purchasing authorization. So the bid has been approved by OSC, but each year, Parks will do a new PO for this contract and purchase authorization. At the very top of the PO, it says that the PO was dispatched by email. We do follow up with our vendor to confirm that POs has been received. Now, this does complete the information on the amount-based PO. So we're going to go back to Maria, as she's actually going to walk you through the process of this PO on SFS.
Thank you, Connie. Okay, we will now take a look at the PO on SFS. As you can see, this is the PO 13699, which is for DF Stone. First, we'll take a look at the supplier ID and the supplier name, which is DF Stone Contracting. If we hover over the supplier name, it will give us their name, address, and email information. Below that is the buyer's name. This is the person working on the purchase order. In this instance, it was a Parks purchase order, so it says generic buyer for Parks. Below that is the PA reference number, the purchase authorization number shown here, PA 20003. Now, next we will move down to view the details of line 1 and 2. Each line shows a quantity of 1, as you can see here. Lines 1 and 2 both have descriptions for Clean Beach Sand for 2 different delivery locations. Each line shows a quantity of 1. As you can see, the merchandise amount box is open and can be adjusted if the amount needs to be increased or decreased if more sand is needed. All POs are receiving required. This function is used for payment purposes. We will click on the Receiving tab to view that the receiving is required was selected. As you can see here, it shows as required for this purchase order. Now we will click on the Contract tab to see where the contract number ending in 82380 is listed for this purchase associated to the PA 20003. We will now click back to the Details tab. We will take a look at the Ship To location for line 1. All Ship To locations have a unique number. The park, facility, or historic site. Best practice is to always confirm that you have selected the correct park, and we have a couple of parks with the same name and different delivery locations. We then click the schedule icon here. If we hover at the icon, it shows scheduled. We will click this, which will take us to the screen that has the Ship To unique number, PRK 0110201. Next to that is an envelope, which we would click on to view the Ship To location. At the triangle, PO Ship To address, we would click here and it would show Heckscher State Park. For this line, it is the correct address. We will click OK and return to the main page. Next, we will look at the line comments below. We will click here where it says comments in the bubble. And this particular PO shows parks will call vendor when deliveries are required. We also click Send to Supplier. This will transfer the information to the purchase order for the vendor to see. Once completed here, we will click OK and return to the main page. Once the PO is complete and approved, the PO will show dispatched at the top of the screen here, and valid budget. The PO will be emailed to the vendor. The vendor's email address is here in the header details. We will click here in the header details, which will show where the email ID would be for the vendor's PO to be submitted. This concludes the demonstration of the PO and SFS. We will transition back to Alex, who will speak about available resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, Connie, and Kevin. Before we transition to our questions for today, let's review some of the resources that are available. So we talked a lot today about purchase order best practices, and we looked at 2 specific purchase order examples from parks, but we wanted to make sure that you were aware that there is another resource that's available with some additional purchase order examples. The purchase order best practice guidance document includes some very specific examples of how purchase orders can be properly structured to meet different types of business needs, including situations where you have a medical staffing need, a temp staffing need to request HVAC maintenance services, and general commodity purchases. This guidance document is available on the SFS Secure website under the Procurement Information Center. The Category Code Selection Tool is another great resource available on SFS Secure. Paul spoke about this tool earlier, and it can be used to help you select the most appropriate category code to use. This tool is available also on SFS Secure under the Procurement Information Center. We also talked about the importance of having the right ship to address on your purchase order so that vendors know exactly where to ship the goods or to deliver the services. Maybe after today's session, you realize that you need to add a few new addresses or update a few addresses in SFS. You can use the location and ship to code request form to add or update existing ship to locations in SFS. For more detailed step-by-step training related to purchase orders, we recommend taking a look at the purchase order self-paced training available in SFS Coach. SFS Coach is the repository of training and reference material, and it's available directly within the SFS application. To access SFS Coach, simply sign into SFS and click the SFS Coach icon on My Homepage, or you can select the SFS Coach icon from the navbar. After selecting SFS Coach, you'll be brought to a search page where you can enter Purchase Orders 220 in the Training Material search field and click the search button. So while we're on the topic of SFS Coach, it's important to mention that we have more than just step-by-step self-paced training available for purchase orders. Not only do we have self-paced trainings, we have job aids, we have videos, and reference guides, presentations from previous workshops that have been held, and recordings of previous trainings and workshops that we've held. To check out all different types of purchase order training, enter PO in the SFS Coach process area search field, and then click the search button. Doing so will return all different types of training related to purchase orders. So a few minutes ago, I talked about the PO Best Practices document, which walks through how to set up purchase orders in SFS for different types of scenarios. So in addition to having the PO Best Practices document, we also have best practice guidance documents available for receiving and invoicing. So the Receiving Best Practices document and Invoicing Best Practices document are both available on SFS Secure, and they continue through the P2P lifecycle to show you specific examples of how to enter receipts for different types of purchase orders and how invoices should be set up for different types of purchases that are sent to vendors. Both of these documents, along with the PO Best Practices document, are available on SFS Secure. So now at this time, we're going to pause and we're going to take a look at our questions in the WebEx chat. And we're going to start going through some of the questions that we've received from participants.
Good morning, everyone. This is Marlene Tierney from SFS. And we did receive some questions in the chat, and I thought I would just go through the questions and the answers that were provided. The first question we received was, can you stage a future contract PO release with a specific date? Will we allow the PO to be released on that date? And the answer is yes. You can set up a purchase order to be released on a specific date. And for more information on how to do that, you can go to SFS Coach. We have a course, and it's the CN 210 course. Also, you would just set it up with the date, and it would be a frequency of daily and a duration of 1 time. So that's how you would set that up. But you can also look at the course for more information. The next question we received was, do we have an example showing multiple ship-to locations on one purchase order? And how does the vendor know what item service goes to which location? So I mentioned that Parks did show this. The good news is Parks, and there will be an example in this presentation and in this recording, so you can refer back to it. But you can have a ship-to location for a specific line. And that appears on the purchase order that is dispatched to the vendor, so they know a specific quantity of an item is getting shipped to that specific location. Then we had a really great suggestion from Diane at Docs, and that was regarding the category code selection tool and having that in SFS Coach. We think that's a great idea, and we can do that. We can make that happen. That's a simple request. And we appreciate that feedback and that recommendation, and we're gonna move forward with that. And then there was another question regarding a purchase order that had a P card associated to it. And in this instance, the question was related to a purchase order for more than $10,000. And they asked if they should select print PO to prevent the vendor from getting a copy of the PO. And SFS recommends that you should still email dispatch that purchase order. So one thing that we're really encouraging is for suppliers to log into the supplier portal and receive that purchase order and get the P card information right out of eSupplier. So they can do that themselves. They can go in and they can get it. If you did provide that number over the telephone, which does happen, you can also just put in the comments that additional action is not required, that this is just, a follow-up of a paper, a electronic version of the purchase order, so that they know that they will always get the purchase order via eSupplier. But again, we encourage suppliers to log into eSupplier, get the credit card information from there, and act on the purchase order based on what's in eSupplier. Then we had another question about viewing PO activity and reports related to PO activity. And on the actual PO header, there is a field called or a link labeled Activity Summary, where you can click on that link to see activity related to the purchase order. So if it's specific to one purchase order, we recommend going to that Activity Summary link. If you're looking for reports related to purchase orders, we have a number of them. The two that I recommended to this one person was the PO Activity Detail Report. That is in Sfs Financials. You would go to Purchasing and then Reports, and that's called the PO Activity Detail Report. There is another report that gets a lot of use too, and that's the NYPO 3144, which is, I believe it's called the NY Rec PO Budgetary Report. I think that's the name of it. So you could use that as well. We have a good report in Sfs Analytics as well, and we can share that. That shows like more, not about individual purchase orders. It shows more of like all of your purchase orders over a period of time. So you could certainly use that as well. Oh, and she is looking for all purchase orders. Okay, so we will find that, Amanda, and we will send that report to you, that name. But if you log into Sfs Financials and go to document, Paul has it. Oh, there's another one, GSC Dispatch PO List. That's a query and query viewer. So we can share all of these reports and we can add them. But we do have a number of purchase order reports that are really useful, and that is just one of them. Oh, good. So we'll put this in the chat too. We'll put that name in the chat. Okay, then I think we have new purchase orders or new questions. What is the best method of uploading attachments? Separate documents, everything converted to PDF and combined as one document, zip file with all files in it. So I don't think there's one way to do it better than the other, to be honest. If it gets too large, you may have an issue with attaching it. So that is my only suggestion in terms of if it's extremely large, you will not be able to attach it. Anything over 20 megabytes will create an issue for you. So keep that in mind when you're making an attachment. You can do it at the line level or you can do it at the header level. It's really your preference and what you think would be most effective for the vendor to see. And then there was a question related to updating a purchase order, specifically the price field after it has been dispatched and what that process is. And the process is the PO can be updated by the agency before it routes to the BSD for approval, if you're a BSD hosted agency. If it has already been approved by the BSD but not dispatched, it can be denied back. However, if the purchase order is dispatched, you will request a purchase order change notice through Filenet to the BSD.
Right. So I can elaborate on that a little bit. So if you do have a purchase order that has not yet been dispatched, is in the process of being worked on or reviewed at the agency level, you have the ability to make any updates to that purchase order. If it's being reviewed at the BSD portion of the workflow. Either the BFC approver or reviewer that is working that purchase order can make those updates on your behalf, or you can request that we deny that purchase order back to your workflow at your agency to give you the ability, again, to update that purchase order. And then Marlene mentioned the POCN. If a purchase order has already been dispatched and you are a BSD-hosted agency that pushed that purchase order through BSD workflow, that is when you would utilize BSD POCN Filenet and enter that POCN request. BSD would pick it up immediately and process that purchase order change notice on your behalf.
Thank you, Paul. I have another question I'm hoping you can answer. How do you access the standard comments formulated by the BSD and Sfs to be used on POs?
So that's a very good question about accessing standard comments. So we touched on the standard comments and all of the different standard comments that are available to users in the system. And it's as easy as utilizing the comments section on the purchase order, whether it's in the PO header or the purchase order line on the specific PO line. And so what it is a little bubble, it looks like, on the purchase order. And you would click into that bubble, and inside the bubble, a PO header comments or a PO line comments box will pop up for you in SFS. There is a little hyperlink above the area where you enter comments within that bubble that is called Use Standard Comments. By selecting that Use Standard Comments hyperlink, another little window will pop up, and you can select your comment type using a magnifying glass. So there's a few different options in there, and those are all listed out for you, the different types that we covered earlier. So you just utilize the standard comments bubble, click that standard comments link, and you can select which one you would like. And so by selecting one, it populates in that box for you, and you can review it to make sure that that is accurate information that you would like to use as a standard comment on your purchase order. If that is not the case, you can simply delete it from the box and move on without it. So the option is there. We recommend that users at least check out the standard comments and see if they make sense to use on their procurements.
Thank you, Paul. The next question is related to benefits of sending a purchase order change notice to the vendor. And one reason, there are a couple of instances where Alex mentioned where you would not necessarily send a change order to a vendor, and that's usually related to the accounting behind the purchase order. But any change where you're adding additional quantity or you're ordering more items, that purchase order change notice would definitely want to be dispatched to the vendor so that they know what the change is and that they have an official record of exactly what is being ordered by the agency. I'm going to ask Alex if she can do this, but Alex, they're asking if you can repeat when to use amount-based purchase orders. I don't know if we want to go to that slide, if that's easier.
I'm going to go back to that slide. We have a slide that shows both quantity-based and amount-based orders. Paul, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Sure. So the best example I can give for using an amount-based purchase order, and probably the most common example that we see, is what's called a blanket order. And those blanket orders can be done as quantity-based orders when you can identify the exact quantity that, or there's a set price for the good that you're buying. However, there are often times, and I'll give an example, a common one may be UPS small package delivery services, right? An agency may want to establish a purchase order up front in the beginning of their fiscal year for a given time period, whether that's 6 months or a year. And you establish that blanket order as amount-based. And what that does is it allows you to pay multiple invoices throughout that time period off of that purchase order, and also allows for the fluctuating prices, right? You don't know upfront how much your UPS bill is going to be each month. And so by setting that purchase order as amount only, it allows you that flexibility of using multiple payments at different prices. And so had it been a quantity-based order, it would require you to have a set price on each of those invoices in order to facilitate payment, right? So that is the best example I can give. There are certain other examples where you would use amount-based, but typically you want to do it only when you know that there will be fluctuating prices throughout a given time period. And really typically only for service orders, right? If you're ordering commodities, we really encourage you to utilize the quantity-based order. It helps out the downstream processes, the receiving and the payments. But with amount-based orders, it's a little bit more difficult, especially with the receiving, because it requires you to, I guess, have that invoice up front in order to do receiving. And the whole point of the receiving is to do it as blind receiving, which you cannot do with amount-based orders. So really, we like to avoid amount-based orders when possible, but there are definitely circumstances where you would need to use it.
Thank you, Paul. One question that we did receive was, is this session being recorded? And the answer is yes, the session is being recorded. So if you missed an answer to a question and you want to refer back to it, you can certainly do that by listening to the recording and fast forwarding to the question section as you're listening. So anything we've missed, you can certainly go back to through the recording. One question was about Filenet, and Filenet is used for purchase order change notices for the BSC. It is not used for invoices, and that's what was discontinued.
So just to clarify on that, there are two separate Filenet systems that were used by both the Business Services Center and our customer agencies. And that one that Marlene just mentioned that was discontinued was the Filenet that was used for accounts payable and payment purposes. That has now transitioned to an e-settlements module within SFS. However, we still do utilize a POCN Filenet. And if you need more information on that POCN Filenet process, it's really a simple standard form within Filenet to submit directly to the Business Services Center for your POCNs. For more information on that, I encourage you, please reach out. You can reach out directly to me or to our bscfinance@ogs.ny.gov mailbox, and we can absolutely provide a PowerPoint that walks you through that process, and we can help you get access to that POCN Filenet module if necessary.
Thank you, Paul. We also had one question about vendors not receiving purchase orders. So one thing I want to mention is that in the e-supplier module, vendors do provide their information in terms of how to, the appropriate email address that should be used for purchase orders, but they can also log into e-supplier and view their purchase orders. So they can get them emailed, but they should also be active in e-supplier. They can look at invoices. They can look at purchase orders. We just are encouraging them to log in and to view anything that's appropriate for their vendor in eSupplier.
And to elaborate on that again, the service that I talked about earlier that the BSC offers is if your purchase order, if you're a BSC hosted agency and your purchase order comes through our workflow, we do monitor that PO dispatch mailbox to ensure that purchase orders are delivered successfully. That being said, there may be an email address that is a valid email address associated to a vendor profile where the purchase order gets sent. And so it appears to all parties that the purchase order was delivered successfully. That vendor may not utilize that email address anymore, and no one has any way of knowing that, right? And so we monitor for undeliverable emails that are kicked back, if you will, from the system, and then we follow up on those. If you are aware of specific purchase orders or specific vendors that are continually not receiving purchase orders, please also let the BSC know that, and we can look into that as well and work directly with you guys or with the vendor to get a proper email address established in their profile.
Great, thank you. I am just adding the report that Paul mentioned that would give you information about dispatch purchase orders. This is a query out of Query Viewer, so you would need access to Query Viewer in order to run it. But again, that's one of the reports that we mentioned during the call that we encourage users to use. I think we are up to date on the questions. And if there's something that we see, we certainly have the chat. If there's anything we're going to follow up on, if we said we would follow up with you after the call, we will do that, and we will contact you directly. So there was one question about, can you give examples of each standard comment should be used? The comments are pretty self-explanatory, right? Like, they're pretty descriptive, Paul?
Yeah, so I don't know, Jeremy, if you want to go back to that slide real quick. We did have a slide with a few bullet points for the examples of the standard comments, and as Marlene just said, they are relatively self-explanatory. The first one may be a little bit confusing the way it's spelled out, right? SFS PO/AC 130 terms is standard terms that apply to your purchase order, to all purchase orders. That one's a little bit more in-depth. The Appendix A is a standard comment that if you are a BSC hosted agency and send a purchase order through the BSC, the Appendix A language is automatically applied to all of your purchase orders, as I mentioned, in that PO footer part of your purchase order. If you are doing your own purchase orders or issuing purchase orders via agency contract that do not come through the BSC, you have the ability to use that Appendix A standard comment. And what that is just a basic rundown of the rules and regulations that are applied in the New York State Appendix A and should be applied to all purchase orders issued by New York State agencies. A blanket order is, the blurb for that is, it's really just a short paragraph notifying the vendor that this is in fact a blanket order, that the intention is not to receive all of the goods on this purchase order at once. That is the last thing we want with blanket orders, to order 1 million rolls of toilet paper we'll use, and to receive 1 million rolls of toilet paper all at once. And so it's a good indicator to that vendor to say, please note this is a blanket order. We expect multiple deliveries on this purchase order, and we will notify you when those deliveries are required. Confirming order is along the same lines, right? We want to notify, when applicable, that this is a confirming order. Now, typically, as I mentioned before, confirming orders don't go to vendors, but in some instances, you may want the vendor to have a copy of that purchase order, or they may want a copy of it for their records. And so that is just a blurb that can be used to indicate to everybody involved in the process that this is a confirming order, especially the accounts payable team as well. When they see that, they're notified that this has an invoice associated or multiple invoices associated and needs to be paid immediately. The payment request and processing is a little bit different as well, a little more in-depth. It kind of spells out how to submit a proper invoice and where to send your invoices to, and so more important information for the vendor. And then P-card as well is indicating that it's a P-card purchase. A procurement card is associated with this purchase, and the vendor needs to take further action to identify that P-card information using the link or using that Sfs Vendor Portal. And so again, we encourage you to just, if you're in a purchase order in the add update module, to go take a look at these standard comments and see what the language is. And of course, as always, we recommend that you give us any feedback you have on improvement opportunities or additional standard comments that could be added.
Well, that allowed somebody to ask another question, Paul. So this one's for you. Is it the agency's discretion on determining if a PO is best established as quantity-based versus amount-based? Does the BSC provide guidance, or how do they respond when they see that? So
that's a very good question, and Alex and I both kind of stressed the importance of those amount-based versus quantity-based orders, and as a best practice, which you know is the purpose of this presentation, we like to see that when possible, purchase orders are established as quantity-based. The short answer to this is yes, it is at the agency's discretion on what type of purchase order you would like to set up. And sometimes, just to be honest, it works better for some agencies to utilize amount-based orders for certain types of purchases, and that is completely understandable. We just like to stress that when possible, you really should be using those quantity-based orders. And the more that you do utilize quantity-based orders, you will begin to see those downstream effects and how it benefits you as an agency, the BSC, and also the payment offices that are establishing those vouchers and the e-settlement process within SFS. So So we do encourage it, but yes, it is at the agency's discretion.
And there is another question about best practices or guidance related to multiple line changes and additions, adding multiple attachments, things like that.
Yeah, so another really good question, and this pertains to the purchase order change notices and using that standard form in POC and Filenet. So if you have a request where you may need multiple changes done to a purchase order, and believe me, we see this on a daily basis. You don't always need just one simple change done. So there are indicators on that standard form to identify what type of change notice you're requesting. And one of the options is other, right? And so if you have multiple changes for one purchase order to multiple lines on that purchase order, we recommend you use other. And then you have the ability on that form to spell out exactly what those changes are going to be. So you can be as specific as you want, and we encourage that to avoid having to, communicate back and forth in Filenet. So spell out exactly what needs to be done, specific to each purchase order line in that description box that's available on the standard form. Again, oftentimes we see large purchase orders with many, many PO lines, and changes need to be done to multiple lines at once. If you prefer to set up an Excel spreadsheet or a Word document detailing the different changes that need to be made and make that one single attachment, we can also do that. We do recommend, if you're doing multiple changes at different times, you do an individual POCN request for each change. But if it's all these changes happening at once to the same purchase order, any type of spreadsheet, Word document, or spelling it out in the description is acceptable.
And there was a question about the recording availability. So it will be available through OSD. There's going to be, a fall conference link to recordings where the information will be.
Yep, generally where the presentations are posted, OSD will also post a link to the recording. We will provide that recording to OSD so we can get it added along with all the other sessions that are being recorded for this fall conference.
Okay, and we did get a question from Christine. Christine, we can definitely follow up with you, but distributions related to a purchase order line is the accounting associated to the line, so it's the actual chart of account values on the distribution line that where the budget is coming from. So I hope that if you have any other questions, you can certainly reach out to the Sfs Help Desk. If there's something we didn't answer or you still need follow-up, please contact the Sfs Help Desk and we can answer your question. And that's all we have.
Thank you again, everyone, for attending our session today. As a reminder, the presentation is already posted to the OSD Fall Conference website. We will be providing the recording link to the OSD team as well, so they will be posting the recording of this session to the Fall Conference website as well. Again, we thank you very much for your time and participation today. We hope you found the session informative. We look forward to working with you going forward. Thank you.